The elevator doors slammed shut behind me, my hands trembling so badly that coffee splashed onto my white blouse. "We lost your application," Alistair said from across the HR office, smirking like it was some kind of joke, like I was nothing more than a file he could shred and forget about. I froze in the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs, disbelief making my chest tighten until I could barely breathe. The words felt like glass cutting into my confidence, sharp and deliberate. Lost my application. Really? I'd spent 6 months perfecting that application, staying late every single night, polishing every report, every spreadsheet, every detail that screamed I was the best candidate for the senior analyst position. And here he was, the HR manager, acting as if my ambition was nothing more than a punchline to share with his colleagues. I wanted to scream, to throw my coffee mug across that pristine office, but I swallowed the words, forcing a calm I absolutely didn't feel. Because this wasn't just HR incompetence, it was deliberate. I could see it in the way he glanced at Dorian, the newly promoted junior analyst, smirking like they shared a secret I wasn't invited to. That's when the anger hit me, not the petty they took my shot anger, but a sharper, colder realization that cut through everything else. I was being erased, intentionally, systematically, and someone else was stepping into the place I deserved, the position I'd earned through 3 years of flawless work. My name is Tamsin, and I've never let anyone get away with underestimating me. Not in school, not in my previous jobs, and certainly not here. At that moment, standing in that sterile hallway with coffee stains spreading across my chest, I made a silent vow. If they thought they could bury me, they were about to learn the longest, smartest lesson of their professional lives. What they didn't know, what Alistair couldn't possibly know, was that compliance had been quietly auditing the HR files for months. I'd heard whispers about it from colleagues who worked on the administrative side, and what they would find in those files would change absolutely everything. I walked back to my desk slowly, deliberately, my mind already spinning through possibilities and strategies. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Within hours of that humiliating encounter, whispers of an irregularity in the HR files reached me through the office grapevine. The very files Alistair thought he had buried me under apparently contained proof of favoritism, negligence, and possibly worse, evidence that could ruin his entire career. I heard it first from Keiko in accounting, who mentioned casually during lunch that compliance had flagged several promotional records for review. My pulse quickened. This was the spark I needed. And so began what I can only describe as a careful, calculated plan, a chess game where every single move I made would be precise, methodical, and completely unstoppable. This wasn't just about revenge, though I won't pretend that wasn't part of it. This was about justice, real justice, the kind that comes when arrogant people finally face consequences for their actions. That evening, I sat at my desk long after everyone else had left, staring at the city skyline through my office window. The lights twinkled below, thousands of people living their lives, unaware of the small war beginning in this corporate tower. Justice, I realized as I gathered my things and headed home, tastes sweetest when it's inevitable, when the arrogant finally fall by their own hand. I retreated to my office the next morning, forcing a calm that felt like it was cracking at the edges with every passing minute. My hands were clenched under my desk, jaw tight enough that it ached. I replayed the scene in my head obsessively, every sarcastic glance Alistair had given me, every whispered laugh between him and Dorian, every subtle gesture that screamed disrespect. My internal monologue was screaming at me. They think I'll break. They think I'll quit. They think I'm just another employee they can dismiss and forget about. But they don't know me. They don't know what I'm capable of when someone pushes me into a corner. I started making mental notes, cataloging every interaction I'd had with HR over the past year. Every email, every conversation, every time I'd been passed over or ignored or treated like my work didn't matter. Patience, I realized, would be my weapon, not rage, not confrontation, patience and precision. I would document everything, gather every piece of evidence, and wait for exactly the right moment to strike. Because when I did strike, it would be devastating. It would be undeniable, and there would be absolutely no way for them to dismiss or ignore what I had to show. A slip-up by Alistair landed in my inbox 3 days later, a file attachment that was clearly mislabeled. The email was meant for someone else in HR, but he'd accidentally included me in the distribution list. I opened it carefully, my pulse rising with each line I read. The document contained promotional recommendations for the past quarter, and something about it wasn't right. There was an anomaly, a tiny crack in their perfect facade that most people would have missed. Certain names appeared multiple times with approvals that seemed to bypass normal review procedures. Dorian's name was prominent. My name appeared once with a notation that made my blood run cold. Application misplaced. Recommend reposting position. Misplaced. Not lost. Misplaced. That single word told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional manipulation, but I didn't act yet. I didn't forward the email or confront anyone or make any move that would reveal I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see. Instead, I saved the file to 3 different locations: my personal drive, a USB stick, and a cloud storage account. Then I archived the email and continued with my day as if nothing had happened. I watched. I waited. And I started building my case, piece by careful piece. Over the next several days, I quietly monitored HR and Dorian with the focus of someone conducting surveillance. I offered forced smiles when we passed in the hallways, polite nods during team meetings, pretending I was perfectly okay with how things had turned out. But I was watching everything. I noticed the favoritism that others seemed blind to, how Alistair always defended Dorian in meetings, how Dorian got the best project assignments, how criticism that would have destroyed my reputation somehow never touched him. I saw the small betrayals that accumulated like drops of water eventually carving through stone. My anger, which had initially burned hot and chaotic, began to simmer into something colder and more dangerous: strategy. I started keeping a detailed log of every interaction, every meeting, every decision that seemed questionable. I documented which projects Dorian was assigned and compared them to my own assignments. The pattern was undeniable to anyone willing to actually look at the data. He received high-visibility projects with generous timelines and significant support. I received tedious, time-consuming work with impossible deadlines and minimal resources. It was a systematic pattern designed to make him shine, while ensuring I would eventually burn out or quit. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated my capacity for patience and my attention to detail. Late one evening, about 2 weeks after the initial incident, I was working late when I overheard something that changed everything. I'd stayed past 7 o'clock to finish a report that was due the next morning, one of those impossible deadlines I'd mentioned. The office was mostly empty, silent except for the hum of computers and air conditioning. That's when I heard voices coming from the compliance office down the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized the voice of Mukkaz, one of the senior compliance officers. He was on the phone, and his voice carried that particular tone of frustration that meant something significant was happening. "The discrepancies in the HR files are more extensive than we initially thought," he was saying. "We're finding patterns of favoritism, applications that were supposedly lost but actually exist in archived folders, promotions that bypassed required review procedures." My stomach twisted, but not with anxiety, with excitement. This was the spark I'd been waiting for. They were already investigating. They'd already found irregularities. I didn't need to expose anything. I just needed to make sure they found the right evidence at the right time. I left the office quietly, my mind racing with possibilities. They just didn't know what else they'd left in those files, what other evidence was waiting to be discovered. I began gathering my own evidence more systematically after that night. I collected emails, carefully documenting timestamps, promotions that had been unfairly given, projects that had been reassigned without justification. My internal monologue during this time revealed something I hadn't fully acknowledged about myself. I was meticulous, obsessively so. Every move would be precise. Every step would be undeniable. I created a detailed timeline showing exactly when I'd submitted my application, who had confirmed receipt, and when it had supposedly been lost. I gathered performance reviews that showed my consistent excellence. I compiled client feedback that praised my work specifically. I collected emails showing projects I'd completed successfully that were later credited to others. It was exhausting work, requiring me to stay late every night, but it was also strangely satisfying. Each piece of evidence I gathered felt like another nail in the coffin I was building. Not for me, for them. The people who tried to erase me were about to discover that erasing someone requires more than just losing an application. It requires making sure there's no evidence they ever existed. And I had left evidence everywhere. My first small victory came during a department meeting about 3 weeks after the initial incident. Alista was presenting the quarterly HR metrics, confidently discussing retention rates and promotion statistics. He mentioned casually that all promotional applications had been processed according to standard procedures, implying that everything was running smoothly and transparently. That's when I spoke up for the first time since my application had been lost. "Actually," I said calmly, raising my hand slightly, "I have documentation showing that my application was received and logged on March 15th, but the promotional announcement went out on March 20th, 5 days later. The standard review period is supposed to be 2 weeks minimum." The room went quiet. Alista's expression flickered with annoyance. "I'd need to verify those dates," he said dismissively. I pulled out my phone and displayed an email with the timestamp clearly visible. "I can forward this to you if you'd like. It's the confirmation email from HR acknowledging receipt of my application materials." Another manager, someone I'd always respected named Helena, nodded slowly. "That does seem like an unusually quick turnaround," she observed. It was a small victory, barely noticeable to most people in that room. But I saw Alista's jaw tighten. I saw the way his confidence wavered for just a moment, and I felt my own confidence grow stronger. That small confrontation seemed to trigger something, because Dorian started showing even more arrogance over the following days. He began flaunting the promotion openly, making comments in meetings about learning to adapt to senior-level responsibilities, and offering unsolicited advice to people who had far more experience than he did. It was painful to watch, not because I envied him, but because I knew his arrogance was digging his own grave. Every overconfident comment, every dismissive gesture toward more experienced colleagues, every moment where he acted like he'd earned something he clearly hadn't, all of it was building resentment among the team. I internalized my anger during this period and refined my plan. I realized that I didn't need to actively destroy them. I just needed to document their behavior and make sure the right people saw the documentation at the right time. Dorian's arrogance would be his own downfall. Alista's dismissiveness would be his undoing. I just needed to be patient enough to let them hang themselves with their own rope. So I smiled. I nodded. I congratulated Dorian on his promotion with what I hoped seemed like genuine warmth, and I continued gathering evidence with the methodical patience of someone who knew exactly how this story would end. I started dropping subtle hints about anomalies in casual conversations, planting seeds of doubt without making direct accusations. During a coffee break with Helena, I mentioned casually that I'd noticed some inconsistencies in how promotional timelines were being recorded. In a meeting with another colleague, I wondered aloud why certain applications seemed to move through the system faster than others. I never accused anyone directly. I never mentioned Alista or Dorian by name in these conversations. I just asked innocent questions that made people start thinking critically about processes they'd previously accepted without question. Alista noticed my inquiries. I could see it in the way his expression would darken when he overheard me talking to other colleagues, in the way frustration would flash across his face during meetings. But he couldn't confront me directly without admitting that there was something worth being defensive about. My internal monologue during these moments was almost gleeful. Yes, get frustrated. Get worried. Start making mistakes because you're anxious. That's exactly what I need. Because anxious people make errors. They get sloppy. They leave evidence in places they shouldn't. And I was watching for every single mistake, ready to document it all. About 5 weeks after the initial incident, compliance officially flagged a suspicious record during their ongoing audit. I heard about it from Marcus himself, who mentioned it casually during an elevator ride. "We found something interesting in the HR promotional files," he said, not knowing how desperately I wanted to hear more. "Evidence of favoritism and mishandled applications. We're doing a deeper review now." My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds serious," I said calmly. "It is. Some applications were marked as lost when they actually exist in archived folders. Some promotions went through without proper review procedures being followed. It's a mess." He shook his head, clearly frustrated with the administrative incompetence he was uncovering. "We'll get to the bottom of it." When the elevator doors opened on my floor, I stepped out with a polite smile, then walked quickly to my office and closed the door. The first real evidence of their negligence was now in compliance's hands. Not because I'd given it to them, because they'd found it themselves during their legitimate audit. This was perfect. This was exactly what I'd been hoping for. Now I just needed to remain calm, keep smiling at Alistair, and hide the excitement that was threatening to burst out of me. Every interaction moving forward needed to be precise and calculated. He still underestimated me. Perfect. The next test of my patience came during a team meeting about 2 weeks later. Alistair tried to gaslight me in front of everyone, claiming that I'd never actually submitted a formal application for the senior analyst position. "I think there might be some confusion," he said smoothly, looking directly at me with a condescending smile. "We have no record of you completing the full application process." I'd been waiting for this. I pulled out my tablet and opened a folder I'd prepared specifically for this moment. "I have the confirmation email from HR dated March 15th, I said calmly, displaying it on the screen. "I also have the receipt confirmation from the internal portal showing that all required documents were uploaded. And I have a follow-up email from your administrative assistant confirming that my materials were complete and ready for review." I passed the tablet to Helena, who was sitting next to me. She examined the documents carefully, then passed it to another manager. The evidence moved around the table while Alistair's face grew progressively redder. "There must have been a system error," he muttered. "No error," I said quietly. "Just facts." The satisfaction that hummed inside me during that moment was quiet but profound. I'd responded with facts so undeniable that even the skeptics in that room couldn't dismiss them. And I'd done it calmly, without anger, without making myself look emotional or unstable. After that meeting, something shifted in the office dynamics. A colleague named Tobias approached me quietly in the break room the next day. "I noticed what you did in that meeting," he said in a low voice. "Standing up to Alistair with actual evidence instead of just complaints. That took guts." I shrugged, trying to appear modest. "I just documented everything, that's all." "Most people don't," he said. "Most people just accept whatever HR tells them and move on, but you're different." He paused, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "If you need anything, someone to verify conversations or back up your timeline, let me know, quietly." I thanked him, genuinely touched by his offer of support, but I also remained cautious. Trust was a tool in this situation, not a weapon I was ready to wield yet. I needed to maintain some anonymity in my evidence gathering, needed to make sure that when compliance finished their investigation, it looked like they'd discovered everything independently rather than because I'd orchestrated it. So I accepted Tobias's offer, but didn't immediately take him up on it. I filed it away as a resource I might need later, another piece on the chessboard I was carefully arranging. Meanwhile, I continued my methodical documentation of every questionable decision, every bypassed procedure, every instance of favoritism that became apparent. About a week after my conversation with Tobias, Dorian made a significant public mistake during a client presentation. He'd been assigned to present a proposal I'd actually developed, another instance of my work being credited to someone else, but he clearly hadn't bothered to understand the details. When the client asked technical questions about implementation timelines, Dorian fumbled badly, giving answers that contradicted the written proposal and demonstrating that he had no real understanding of the project scope. I sat in that meeting and watched him struggle, saying nothing. I didn't jump in to rescue him. I didn't correct his mistakes. I just sat quietly and noted every detail, every confused look from the client, every moment where his incompetence became painfully obvious to everyone in the room. After the meeting, the client specifically asked to speak with me. "I noticed your name on the original proposal documents," she said. "Did you develop this project?" "Yes," I said simply. "I thought so. The presentation didn't match the quality of the written work." "Would you be able to walk me through the implementation plan properly?" I spent 30 minutes giving her the presentation that Dorian should have delivered, answering every question with the confidence that comes from actually understanding your own work. I felt the tide turning slowly but surely in my favor. I began dropping more careful hints to compliance without revealing myself directly. During a casual conversation with Marcus in the cafeteria, I mentioned that I'd heard rumors about inconsistencies in promotional records. "It's probably nothing," I said, keeping my tone light and curious rather than accusatory. "But I wondered if your audit was looking at application timelines and approval processes." Marcus's expression became more focused. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I said. "I submitted an application that apparently got lost, and it made me wonder how often that actually happens. Seems like something that would be tracked, you know." He nodded slowly, clearly thinking about implications I was deliberately planting in his mind. "That's actually a good point. Application tracking should be part of our audit scope." "Probably is already," I said casually, changing the subject before it seemed like I was pushing too hard. But the seed was planted. Within days, I heard through the office grapevine that compliance had expanded their audit to include application tracking and filing procedures. Doubt about HR's processes was spreading like wildfire through the administrative departments, and Alistair was growing increasingly paranoid. I could see it in the way he watched people, in how he'd grown more defensive during meetings, in the tension that never seemed to leave his shoulders. The first real confrontation, if you could call it that, came during a project review meeting about 3 months after the initial incident. Dorian was presenting results from a client account, taking credit for retention strategies I'd actually developed. But this time, I didn't let it slide. "Actually," I said calmly when he finished his presentation, "those retention metrics improved after we implemented the tiered communication strategy I proposed in February. Here's the original proposal with the timeline showing when we made those changes." I pulled up the document on the shared screen, showing my name clearly on the header along with the date, weeks before Dorian had supposedly developed these innovative strategies. The room went quiet. Helena looked at the document, then at Dorian, then at me. "This does appear to predate the timeline Dorian just presented," she said carefully. Dorian's face flushed red. "Well, I refined the approach," he stammered. "Refined," I repeated neutrally. "Of course, the implementation was a team effort. I just want to make sure the development timeline is accurate for our records." It was a small victory, but it cracked their arrogance in a visible way. My calm dominance in that moment, correcting the record with irrefutable evidence while maintaining a professional demeanor, seemed to shift something in how other people viewed me. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't vindictive. I was just insisting on accuracy. Then came the twist I'd been waiting for. About a week after that confrontation, I discovered through a careless comment from an HR assistant that Alistair had destroyed part of the promotional record, specifically, the section containing my original application materials. The assistant mentioned it innocently during a conversation about digital storage policies, not realizing she was revealing something explosive. "Yeah, Alistair had us purge a bunch of old application files last month to free up server space," she said. "Said they were duplicates or incomplete submissions." My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. "Did you keep backups before the purge?" "Oh, sure. Everything goes to the archival system automatically before we delete anything from the active server. IT policy requires it." I thanked her and walked away calmly, but inside I was celebrating. Alistair thought he was clever, thought he'd covered his tracks by deleting files. But he hadn't counted on automatic backup systems that he couldn't control. And he definitely hadn't counted on compliance having access to those backup systems. My internal monologue was almost giddy. They think they're clever. They think they've erased the evidence, but they're not clever. They're just arrogant. And arrogance always leads to mistakes. I didn't need to tell compliance about the deleted files. They would find them naturally, during their audit, when they compared the active server to the archival backups. Sure enough, within 2 weeks, compliance officially flagged HR for serious misconduct. The announcement came through an internal memo that went to all department heads, and the office exploded with whispered speculation. "Serious irregularities have been found in HR promotional processes and record-keeping," the memo stated. "An investigation is underway. All promotional decisions from the past year are under review." Alistair's reaction was immediate and visible. He grew pale when the memo arrived, then spent the rest of the day in closed-door meetings with other HR staff. I could see the panic in his movements, the way his confidence had completely evaporated. But I remained collected, going about my work as if nothing unusual was happening. I ate lunch at my usual time, attended my scheduled meetings, responded to emails with my typical efficiency. Internally, I was watching the walls close in on him with deep satisfaction. This was my revenge, but it was methodical, controlled, and completely unstoppable. I hadn't accused him directly. I hadn't filed a complaint or made a scene. I'd simply documented the truth and waited for compliance to discover it through their legitimate audit process. Now the consequences were unfolding exactly as they should, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. Management called an emergency meeting 3 days after the compliance memo. Every department head was required to attend, along with senior analysts and project leads, which technically now included Dorian, though his invitation was clearly causing him distress. We gathered in the main conference room, and I deliberately sat near the back, wanting to observe rather than be observed. The VP of Operations, a stern woman named Kendra, led the meeting. "We've become aware of serious concerns regarding HR processes," she began without preamble. "Specifically, allegations of favoritism, mishandled applications, and destroyed records. Compliance is conducting a comprehensive audit." Alastair, sitting near the front, attempted to interject. "I can explain the record purging. You'll have your opportunity to provide a formal statement to compliance," Kendra cut him off. "This meeting is to inform everyone that we take these allegations extremely seriously." She went on to explain that all recent promotions would be reviewed, that proper procedures would be reinstated, and that anyone with information about irregularities should contact compliance directly. Alastair struggled visibly to maintain composure as Kendra laid out the investigation scope. I sat quietly in the back, watching his words crumble under scrutiny. Every defensive explanation he tried to offer just made things worse, just highlighted how many procedures he'd bypassed. My methodical patience was paying off in ways I'd barely dared to hope for. The real shift in office dynamics began after that meeting. Senior managers who'd previously dismissed my concerns started asking quiet questions. Helena pulled me aside after a project review to ask if I'd experienced other instances of my work being uncredited. Tobias mentioned hearing rumors that multiple people had complained about application irregularities over the past year. Whispers of favoritism, lost applications, and mismanaged files began surfacing throughout the office. People who'd stayed silent before were suddenly willing to talk, emboldened by the official investigation. I shared my documentation carefully, never offering more than was asked, always framing everything as just the facts rather than personal grievances. I provided timestamps, emails, and project records to anyone who asked, but I never editorialized or dramatized. The evidence spoke for itself, and as more people came forward with their own stories, instances where Dorian had been given unearned credit, times when Alastair had bypassed review procedures, patterns of favoritism that extended beyond just my experience, the full scope of the corruption became undeniable. This wasn't just about my lost application anymore. This was about systemic failure in HR management that had affected multiple people over an extended period. The investigation expanded rapidly to encompass all of it. Then Dorian made his desperate move. Realizing that his promotion was under review and that his lack of actual qualifications was becoming increasingly obvious, he attempted to cover up his mistakes. He submitted a revised version of one of his project reports, backdating it to make it appear that he'd done work he actually hadn't. But he made a critical error. He didn't know that all document revisions were automatically tracked in our system with timestamps showing every edit. When Marcus from compliance noticed the discrepancy during his audit, he flagged it immediately. The revised document's metadata clearly showed it had been edited weeks after its supposed completion date, and the original version, the one that showed minimal contribution from Dorian, still existed in the archival system. I learned about this through Helena, who'd been copied on the compliance inquiry. "He tried to falsify his project contributions," she told me, shaking her head in disbelief. "Marcus caught it within hours." My quiet confidence in that moment felt unshakable. I hadn't needed to expose Dorian directly. His own panic and dishonesty had exposed him. This was the domino effect I'd been waiting for, one person's misconduct revealing another's, creating a cascade of consequences that was now completely beyond anyone's control. The truth had gained its own momentum, rolling forward with unstoppable force. Compliance prepared their final report over the following 2 weeks. The The tension in the office during that period was suffocating. Alista barely left his office except for required meetings, and when he did emerge, he looked exhausted and defeated. Dorian stopped coming in entirely, calling in sick for days at a time. Then the report was released internally. I didn't receive a direct copy, but Helena shared the key findings with me. The audit had uncovered extensive evidence of favoritism in HR processes, multiple instances of applications being deliberately mishandled, systematic bypassing of review procedures, and destruction of records to cover tracks. Alista's conduct was described as grossly negligent at best, deliberately corrupt at worst. Dorian's promotion was flagged as procedurally invalid and substantively unjustified. The report recommended immediate suspension for Alista pending further investigation, reversal of recent promotions that hadn't followed proper procedures, and comprehensive reform of HR oversight. I sat at my desk reading the summary Helena had shared, and my internal monologue was quiet but satisfied. The game is over. They lost because of their own hubris, their own arrogance, their own certainty that they were untouchable. I hadn't destroyed them. They'd destroyed themselves. I just made sure the evidence was impossible to ignore. The consequences came swiftly. Alista was suspended within 24 hours of the report's release. Internal emails documenting the full extent of his favoritism and negligence were leaked somehow. I suspected by someone in compliance who was equally disgusted by what they'd found, and circulated through the office. The public humiliation was complete and devastating. Dorian was demoted back to his original position, his promotion officially rescinded. His attempts to falsify project records became common knowledge, destroying whatever credibility he'd had. Several other people in HR who'd assisted with or enabled Alista's misconduct faced disciplinary action. Then, about a week after Alista's suspension, Kundra called me into her office. My heart raced as I walked through those halls, uncertain what to expect despite everything that had happened. "Tumzun," she said when I entered, gesturing for me to sit. "I want to apologize on behalf of the organization for what you experienced. Your application should never have been lost, and your work should never have gone uncredited." "Thank you," I said carefully. "More importantly, I want to offer you the senior analyst position you applied for. The promotion is yours, effective immediately, with back pay to the date you originally should have been promoted." I don't think I'll ever forget that moment. The quiet, satisfying acknowledgement that I'd been right all along, that my work had value, that justice had prevailed. 2 months later, I stood in my new office, a real office with walls and a door and a window overlooking the city, reflecting on everything that had happened. The promotion had come with not just a title change, but real recognition. My salary had increased substantially. My opinions in meetings carried weight now. Projects that had previously been given to less qualified people were now assigned to me. But more than any of that, I'd learned something crucial about myself and about how systems work. Patience, intelligence, and calm strategy had triumphed over arrogance and cruelty. I'd never raised my voice, never made a scene, never become the emotional woman that people could dismiss. I'd simply documented the truth and waited for the right people to see it. Looking out at that city skyline, the same view I'd had from my old desk, but somehow different now, my internal monologue was clear and empowering. Know your worth. Stand tall. Document everything. Be patient. And let them fall on their own mistakes, because they always will eventually. Arrogant people always underestimate those they consider beneath them, and that underestimation is always their downfall. I'd been erased, dismissed, humiliated, but I'd refused to disappear. I'd refused to be silent. And now I was exactly where I deserved to be, while those who tried to bury me were facing the consequences of their own corruption. That's not revenge. That's justice. And it tastes exactly as sweet as I'd imagined it would.